I know I often think that legacy autos will go bankrupt. They just have a tough road ahead of them, and I'm mainly referring to the US legacy autos. The scenario is that before long, maybe even next year, particularly with the encouragement of the EV bill and endorsement of the US government for electric vehicles, well, all except Tesla, it's all about how this plays out. I've been thinking out loud and researching the Chinese EVs over the last week or so, and listening to what all of you have to say about it too, and researching more on the paths you send me. I'm not trying to find narratives to reinforce my own predictions, but merely trying to research the best prediction. And I think I may be close now to how I see this playing out. This sounds and feels like the most likely scenario. The US consumers will most likely work out electric is the future, especially if they ever drive or are driven in a Tesla. It's the greatest car ever, but there are not enough Teslas for everyone. Perhaps before long, Tesla really could get to about 4 million units a year in the US alone, maybe in 2024, but then that leaves over 10 million other vehicles a year that US consumers still need. Now, I know we have seen EVs in China see massive growth, but a lot of that has been this little wuling, which is not much good to anyone outside of China, so it doesn't really count. I mean, it costs about $4,500 and uses 9 kilowatt-hour batteries. Of course, we have to also factor in that a lot of the growth in China has also been Tesla expanding in Shanghai, and a lot of the other growth is also PHEV. None of the Chinese BEVs are at volume production yet, and I'm not convinced any of them can achieve it. Remember, even Tesla barely survived production hell. I.e., the growth in China is somewhat distorted and might somewhat plateau. Now, when there is an EV credit for EVs in the US, and the US consumers buy all the Teslas they can, and all the fully electric Fords and GMs, then what will be the other 10 million cars they want to buy? Even if every single BEV in China went to the US, then that would only be another 3 million vehicles a year. Granted, that's at today's run rate, but guess what? The vast majority of those are going to be sold in China. A lot of them aren't legal for sale in the US, others have ranges of around 50 miles, and a reasonable proportion of these BEVs are actually Teslas. Even if China doubled their EVs next year, and I know they tripled their growth last year, but that rate is not sustainable. Or if it is, it's likely going to be in the form of the likes of more wulings. Anyway, let's say that they are up to 5 million BEVs a year in China in a year's time, and perhaps even 20% are non-Teslas that have a tolerable range for the US market and are safe enough to meet regulation, then that's 1 million. Oh, and that's just how many are eligible for the US. Again, China wants most of them, not to mention other markets like the rest of Asia and Europe, or even Australia. Easier markets for them with less competition, and where they could possibly even sell at a higher price and maybe increase their chances of making a profit. That might leave just 200,000 or so Chinese BEVs for the US. We are talking around the start of 2023. Now, we still have a discrepancy of about 10 million more cars that consumers want in the US. What alternatives are left? ICE and plug-in hybrids. Okay, sure, perhaps demand for these cars will dwindle, and car owners will keep their older cars longer, and some of them are willing to wait 2 or 3 years for a Tesla maybe, or maybe 5 years for a Cybertruck. But some people need cars. I think I was being naive before, thinking that legacy companies will go under so fast. It will be a couple more years when GM and Ford's battery factories start kicking in too, and perhaps combined they may be up to 1 million BEVs as early as 2024. Well, even if the Chinese have quadrupled their growth from 2022, i.e. about 8 times what they're doing today, then that's still probably only going to be about 1 million a year from China that could be exported to the US, and that's really a stretch. By 2025, there may be 2 million legacy auto BEVs a year in the US, and possibly 6 million Teslas. Yes, the Chinese can certainly ramp up faster than legacy autos, especially given the fact they're using LFP batteries. But the US legacy autos only have to serve one market, the US. If the Chinese autos are also trying to serve the US, it's with whatever they have left after domestic sales and other exports. Exports to countries that have higher priced vehicles than the US, i.e. potentially more profit margins for Chinese EVs in Europe than the US. Okay, there perhaps is a market for Chinese EVs in the US, but they won't dominate the US in the same way the Japanese did. They won't be able to ramp up that fast, and American consumers will have to accept lower ranges and possibly higher prices than the legacy autos EVs and Teslas due to tariffs and subsidies. Is it that the Chinese have ramped up so fast recently that everyone thinks it will be consistent and the growth will continue on this trajectory? Remember, a lot of this ramping is the wuling, which is an incredibly basic, simple EV to make. And the fact XPeng increased 200% over the last year, well, BYD only increased their BEVs 100% over the last year. That's still an impressive increase, but it's slowing down as they get to larger numbers. Just like XPeng's growth will likely not grow 200% over the next year again. It will be slower growth. I don't think we can keep expecting growth rates to increase at the same rate, especially when the production numbers of these models start to hit around the 10,000 units a month level, which seems to be very difficult for any of them, besides Tesla, to get past. Volkswagen are actually doing the best job in approaching volume production. I mean, let's compare it to Rivian that increased something like 50% over a month. That works out at 13,000 annual growth, going from 2 vehicles a day to 3 vehicles a day. When numbers are low, percentage growth is easier. Yet we're still seeing Tesla getting close to 100% growth still, even at their level. Rivian and Lucid are pointless to even consider in this race. They're not going to be major players anytime soon, which is a real shame, especially with the amount of funding they have. They could have perhaps released some LFP versions of vehicles to at least get production numbers up, even if they only have 200 miles of range. Do not rely on these companies to make a massive contribution to the transition off fossil fuels. Look, I've never said Chinese EVs are bad, it's just their range and performance is nowhere near as good as Tesla's, or even legacy autos EVs. And perhaps I am basing a lot of these assumptions on US consumers demanding much higher ranges for their EVs, and even if said assumption is true, which it appears to be judging by market research, then it may change over time when there are more chargers and consumers have more confidence and range anxiety is not a thing. But perhaps consumers have no choice and the charging will become ubiquitous. So EVs with less range may become more tolerable. And of course, these cars will continue to improve their range over time. As battery technologies advance, along with motors, powertrains and software, the Chinese EV companies have a few years at their current burn rate until they run out of capital. BYD can fund their growth with their hybrid business, but at some stage they need to make profits. This is only achieved through economies of scale by ramping up to volume, or alternatively just raising prices, which they may do. Tesla's getting away with it, and Volkswagen is another major player in the BEV game, and they may even be able to supply another million or so to the US market around this time too. But these Chinese EVs are still going to cost a lot more than a PHEV with a rebate. On the other hand, I don't think Legacy can make enough plug-in hybrids to supply the demand anyway, which means ICE will still be selling. But gasoline prices could keep increasing, and electric just becomes that much better value as a result. There's so many factors at play here, both micro and macro. We have the green movement of people wanting zero emissions to help climate change. And not to mention electric cars don't poison people. We have ICE cars costing more and more to run, yet huge rebates on plug-in hybrids, and limited supply of all electric vehicles. Wow, all this talk I do about transportation prices dropping, well, that might not be for some time. We may see prices increase a lot first. Sure, if you have electric, then it's lower cost, but the electric car may not be cheap to buy. I think maybe the full transition to electric, at least in the US, may not be until the end of the decade, and I think it's going to end up requiring a lot more Teslas than we think. And when I say transition, I'm only talking about new car sales, not the actual fleet, and I'm also only referring to the US, where they spend the most on cars, and the US government is doing the most about the transition. I think it's likely all electric cars become more expensive as their value is added as fuel prices rise and more consumers understand the benefits. In addition to that, they will need to raise prices to make profits to survive if they can't hit volume production. But if we see fuel prices increase so much, they'll be felt harder in Europe, where gas does cost more, which would mean an electric car becomes better value to them. I think perhaps the Chinese EVs could sell them in Europe for a decent profit, enough to end up making a net profit, but the range on those cars are not suitable for the likes of autobahns. The batteries simply won't last long enough on the likes of the autobahns or even the highways in Europe with 130 km/h speed limits. Wow, this is so conflicting, trying to work all this out, with quite a few variables in the mix too, hence why I obviously haven't just started with some narrative that I'm trying to reinforce, but I'm trying to work out the entire picture totally objectively. Of course I want to see the mission completed as soon as possible, i.e. the transition to electric vehicles and off fossil fuels, but I'm not just trying to be naive about it all either. All your feedback has been great too. I very much appreciate the effort some of you put into your comments as well. This has been a great thought experiment, and I know a lot of you don't agree with everything I say, but at least you still admit that I am raising some good points, and at least making you think differently. The thing I'm learning the most is just how much further ahead Tesla is than everyone, and no one is coming close to dethroning the king, and this is at a time before Tesla are even using their own in-house batteries. It really is going to be very interesting to see how all this plays out, but if anyone is saying they know how it will play out, then they're simply wrong. I think my overall conclusion here is is that there are just far too many variables to predict how this will go yet. Thanks for listening. Please hit the thumbs up and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter and talk to me on Patreon.